In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a sculptor lies dead, strangled by a stable rope in his own workshop. A missing bronze figurine, a monogrammed button, and a trail of lies point to 4 suspects: a nervous apprentice, a proud patron, a venomous critic, and a bitter rival. Only Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eyes and sharper mind, can unravel the envy and betrayal that carved a path to murder. Will she uncover the truth before the killer's shadow strikes again? Chapter 1. The Silent Studio. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the village's thatched cottages and lending an air of quiet secrecy to the day. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her favourite armchair by the bay window, worked her knitting needles with a rhythm as steady as the ticking of the mantelpiece clock. Her eyes, bright and bird-like, darted occasionally to the lane outside, where the postman's bicycle wobbled past and Mrs. Price from the bakery hurried along with a basket of scones. It was a morning like any other, yet Miss Marple sensed a disturbance in the village's usual harmony, a faint ripple in the fabric of daily life. The news came, as it often did, via her maid Lily, who bustled in with a tray of tea and a gleam of excitement in her eyes. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful!" Lily exclaimed, setting the tray down with a clatter. "Mr. Vane, that sculptor gentleman, he's been found dead in his workshop, strangled, they say, with a rope round his neck." Miss Marple's needles paused just for a moment, as she absorbed the gravity of the words. "Strangled, you say?" she murmured, her voice calm, but her mind already turning. "How very shocking! Who found him, Lily?" "It was young Tom, the milk boy," Lily replied, eager to share the details. "Went to deliver this morning and saw the door ajar. Looked in, and there was Mr. Vane, slumped by his workbench, cold as stone. Constable Harrow's there now, roping off the place." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle concern, though behind it her thoughts were as precise as the stitches on her needles. Lionel Vane, a man of talent and temper, had made his mark in St. Mary Mead, his sculptures adorning the gardens of the wealthy and drawing curious visitors to his workshop. Murder, however, was a visitor no one expected. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had donned her tweed coat and a sensible hat, accepting an invitation from Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, to visit the scene. "You've such a knack for seeing things clearly, Jane," Mrs. Clement had said over the telephone, her voice trembling with the thrill of tragedy. "The police could use your perspective." Miss Marple, who never refused a chance to observe human nature, made her way to the edge of the village where Vane's workshop stood, a converted barn of weathered timber, its windows glinting like wary eyes in the pale sunlight. Constable Harrow, a sturdy man with a moustache that seemed to bristle with authority, greeted her with a polite but distracted nod. "Miss Marple, good of you to come," he said, though his tone suggested he found her presence more a courtesy than a necessity. The body had been taken to the morgue, but the workshop remained untouched, a tableau of interrupted creation. Marble dust coated the floor, catching the light in faint sparkles. Chisels and hammers lay scattered across a workbench, and in the centre of the room stood a half-finished statue. A woman, her arms raised as if in supplication, her face a blank expanse of uncarved stone. The air was heavy with the scent of stone and oil, and something else, a faint unsettling stillness. Miss Marple's gaze settled on a length of coarse rope, coiled like a serpent on the workbench. "The murder weapon, I presume?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. Harrow nodded. Aye, miss. Not the sort you'd find here, though. It's stable rope, used for tethering horses. Odd thing to bring to a sculptor's workshop, Miss Marple tilted her head, considering. Odd indeed, she murmured. And yet, people do bring the strangest things when they mean harm. She moved carefully through the space, her eyes noting details Harrow had overlooked. A smudge of clay on the doorframe, a single footprint in the dust near the statue, too large for Vane's slight frame. The workshop was a place of beauty and chaos, but it was the absence of something that caught her attention. On a shelf where Vane displayed his smaller works, delicate bronzes of dancers and birds, there was a conspicuous gap. Was something taken? She asked, pointing to the empty space. Harrow frowned, consulting his notebook. One of the neighbours mentioned a bronze figurine, a little thing, no bigger than a teacup. Can't say when it went missing, though Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, a sign of her mind at work. A missing piece, she said, almost to herself. How like people to leave gaps in their stories. She turned to Harrow, her smile disarming. Tell me, Constable, who was seen here last evening? Mr. Vane was not a man to work alone in silence, I think. Harrow, caught off guard by her directness, rattled off the names. Clara Bell, the apprentice, Sir Henry Grayson, the patron, Felix Durant, the critic, and Roland Kemp, the rival sculptor. Each had a reason to be near the workshop. And each, Miss Marple suspected, had a reason to lie. As she left the barn, the mist had lifted, revealing the rolling hills beyond. Miss Marple paused, her eyes lingering on the statue's unfinished face. A sculptor-shaped stone, she thought, but it is human nature that shaped a crime. With a quiet resolve, she set off toward the village, her mind already weaving the threads of motive and opportunity into a pattern only she could see. Chapter 2. The cast of suspects. The sun had climbed to its zenith over St. Mary Mead, casting a pale, wintry light through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage. She sat by her fire, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, her knitting needles clicking with a rhythm that belied the rapid workings of her mind. The news of Lionel Vane's murder had spread through the village like wildfire through dry grass, and with it came the inevitable tide of speculation. Miss Marple, however, preferred facts to gossip. Though she knew the latter often hid kernels of truth, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had promised to send Constable Harrow to her cottage with details of the investigation, and Miss Marple awaited his arrival with the patience of one who understood that haste muddied clarity. The clock struck noon, its chimes mingling with the crunch of gravel outside. Constable Harrow, his face flushed from the chill, entered with a notebook clutched tightly in his gloved hand. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his cap. "Mrs. Clement said you'd want to know who was about last night. I've got the names of those seen near Mr. Vane's workshop, and their stories, or what they're willing to tell at any rate." Miss Marple smiled, gesturing to a chair. "Do sit down, Constable. A cup of tea, perhaps, and then you must tell me everything." Harrow, unaccustomed to such gentle hospitality from those he questioned, sat awkwardly, balancing his notebook on his knee. "No tea, thank you, miss. I've 4 names for you, all with some connection to Vane. There's Clara Bell, his apprentice, a young thing, barely 20. Then Sir Henry Grayson, his patron, lives up at the manor. Mr. Felix Durant, that critic who writes for the county paper, and Roland Kemp, another sculptor from Danefield. Each one was spotted near the workshop yesterday evening, though their reasons don't quite line up." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "Reasons, Constable, are like threads in a tapestry. They may seem separate, but they weave together in curious ways. Tell me about Clara Bell first." Harrow flipped open his notebook, his finger tracing a scrawled line. "Clara's a quiet sort. Been working for Vane these past 2 years. Says she left the workshop at 6 to visit her mother, who's been poorly. Her mother's cottage is just off the high street, so it's a short walk. But the neighbour, Mrs. Tuttle, swears she didn't see Clara till near dawn." Odd that Miss Marple nodded, her mind conjuring an image of Clara, a slight girl with nervous hands, perhaps hiding more than her timid demeanour suggested. "And Sir Henry," she prompted. Harrow shifted in his seat. "Sir Henry's a big man in these parts. Funds half the village's projects. He says he stopped by at 7 to discuss a new statue for his garden. Left by 8, he claims, though his driver Jenkins says the car was parked near the workshop till closer to 10. Sir Henry's not the sort to be questioned, mind, so I've not pressed him." Yet Miss Marple's lips twitched, a faint smile that spoke of her familiarity with men like Sir Henry. Proud, accustomed to deference, and perhaps not above bending the truth to protect their dignity. "And Mr. Durant?" she asked. Harrow's moustache twitched with distaste. "Felix Durant's a sharp-tongued fellow, writes reviews that could curdle milk. He had a row with Vane at the workshop around 8, over a piece in the paper calling Vane's latest work derivative. Durant says he left after the argument, headed to the Red Lion for a drink. The barman confirms he was there, but not till 9:30, which leaves a gap." Miss Marple's needles resumed their dance, her mind filing away the critic's venom. A man who wielded words like knives might wield other weapons too. "And Mr. Kemp?" she said, her tone deceptively mild. Harrow's brow furrowed. "Roland Kemp's a sculptor, like Vane, but his stars faded while Vane's rose. Lives in Danefield, runs a struggling studio. He says he was walking by the river last night, nowhere near the workshop, but young Billy Hodge, the blacksmith's lad, saw a man matching Kemp's build, tall, broad-shouldered, near Vane's barn around midnight. Kemp's not keen to talk, clammed up when I pressed him." Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes drifting to the fire. "4 people, 4 stories, and not one quite fits," she murmured. "Thank you, Constable." "You've been most helpful," Harrow, sensing dismissal, stood and adjusted his cap. "I'll keep you posted, Miss Marple, if anything else turns up." As he left, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts already threading through the tangle of alibis. She resolved to meet each suspect herself, for she knew that faces and gestures often revealed what words concealed. Her first visit was to Clara Bell, whose cottage stood at the end of a narrow lane, its garden overgrown with nettles. Clara opened the door, her face pale, her dark hair pulled back in a hasty bun. Her hands, stained with clay and ink, twisted nervously as she invited Miss Marple inside. The sitting room was small, cluttered with sketches and half-finished models, the air heavy with the scent of linseed oil. "I'm so sorry about Mr. Vane," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was difficult, but brilliant. I can't believe he's gone." Miss Marple settled into a worn armchair, her eyes kind but searching. "It must be hard, my dear, losing such a mentor. You were with him yesterday, I understand?" Clara nodded, her fingers plucking at her sleeve. "Till 6, yes. I was helping with the new statue, the one of the woman, Then I went to see Mother. She's been ill, you know." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And you stayed with her all evening?" Clara hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. "Yes, till late. She needed me." Miss Marple noted the flicker of unease, the way Clara's hands trembled. "You must have been very fond of Mr. Vane," she said gently. Clara's cheeks flushed. "He taught me everything, but he could be harsh. If I chipped the stone wrong, he'd shout, 'Call me clumsy.' Still, I owed him so much." Miss Marple smiled, her mind catching on the bruise she'd glimpsed on Clara's wrist the day before. "You're very loyal, my dear," she said, rising. "Take care of yourself." As she left, she thought of her niece's maid, who'd once hidden a sweetheart's roughness behind excuses. Loyalty, she knew, could mask fear. Next, Miss Marple made her way to Grayson Manor, a grand Georgian pile surrounded by manicured lawns. Sir Henry Grayson received her in his library, a room lined with books he seemed unlikely to have read. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a florid complexion and a manner that suggested he was accustomed to command. "Miss Marple," he boomed, offering her a chair, "I'm told you're assisting the police." A grim business, Vane's death. He was a genius, you know, though a trifle temperamental. Miss Marple's eyes roamed the room, noting the locked cabinet behind Sir Henry's desk. "You visited him last evening, I believe," she said. Sir Henry nodded, his fingers drumming on the armrest. "Indeed, to discuss a new piece for my rose garden, a fountain perhaps." "I was there from 7 to 8, no later." Vane was in high spirits, full of ideas. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "And you saw no one else?" Sir Henry's smile tightened. "No one." The place was quiet. She thanked him and wandered to the gallery, where Vane's sculptures stood in proud array. A statue of Apollo caught her eye, its marble gleaming under the chandelier. She wondered about Sir Henry's locked cabinet. Private papers, he'd said, but men of his sort often locked away more than letters. As she left the manor, she recalled old Mr. Hartley, a village squire who'd hidden debts behind a jovial facade. Pride, she thought, was a heavy burden. Felix Durant was her next call, found in the tea-room on the high street, his thin frame hunched over a notebook. His sharp features and darting eyes gave him the look of a fox, wary and cunning. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice clipped, "I suppose you're here about Vane." A terrible loss. Though his work had slipped of late, Miss Marple settled opposite him, her demeanour as soothing as chamomile. "You argued with him, I hear," she said. Durant's lips pursed. "A professional disagreement." "My review called his latest exhibition lackluster," which it was. "He took it badly, shouted me out of the workshop by 8. I went to the Red Lion after Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting the pristine shine of Durant's shoes, untouched by the workshop's dust. "You must see many artists," she said. "Do they all react so strongly to criticism?" Durant smirked. "Most do." Vane was worse, thought himself above reproach. It cost him, didn't it? Miss Marple's smile was placid, but her mind was sharp. A man who delighted in others' failures might find satisfaction in more than words. Her final visit was to Danefield, where Roland Kemp's studio crouched like a forgotten relic. The air inside was stale, the tools rusted, and unfinished sculptures loomed like ghosts of ambition. Kemp, a bear of a man with haunted eyes, greeted her with a scowl. "What do you want poking about?" he growled. Miss Marple, undeterred, smiled. "Merely to understand, Mr. Vane's world. You knew him well, I think." Kemp's jaw tightened. "Once. We trained together years ago. Then he surpassed me, took my patrons, my name. I've no cause to mourn him." Miss Marple's gaze fell on a coil of stable rope in the corner, its texture matching the murder weapon. "You were in St. Mary Mead last night?" she asked. Kemp shrugged. "Took a walk by the river. Nowhere near Vane's place." His eyes avoided hers, and Miss Marple thought of young Tommy Pierce, who'd lied about stealing apples until his guilt spilled out. Resentment, she knew, was a slow poison. As she returned to St. Mary Mead, the sky darkened, promising rain. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind sorting the suspects like cards in a game of bridge. Clara's fear, Sir Henry's pride, Durant's malice, Kemp's envy, each held a piece of the puzzle. The missing figurine, the stable rope, the footprint in the dust. These were clues, but it was the human heart that would reveal the truth. She thought of her friend Mrs. Bantry, whose gardener had once sabotaged a rival's roses out of spite. "People," Miss Marple murmured, "are so very predictable." Back in her cottage, she lit the lamp and resumed her knitting. The suspect's stories were like her wool, tangled but not impossible to unravel. She would watch, listen, and wait, for in St. Mary Mead, secrets never stayed buried long. Chapter 3. The Workshop Secrets. The afternoon light filtered through the high windows of Lionel Vane's workshop, casting long shadows across the stone-strewn floor. Miss Jane Marple stood just inside the threshold, her gloved hands clasped lightly, her eyes moving with deliberate care over the scene. The air held a chill, not merely from the autumn day, but from the lingering presence of violence. Constable Harrow had permitted her return to the converted barn, albeit with a gruff reminder to touch nothing. Miss Marple, who had no intention of disturbing evidence, needed only her senses and her understanding of human frailty to uncover what the workshop might reveal. The space was a study in contrasts, order and chaos intertwined like ivy on a trellis. Workbenches lined the walls, cluttered with chisels, mallets, and sketches pinned haphazardly to a corkboard. Marble dust coated every surface, fine as powdered sugar, catching the light in a way that made the room seem alive, yet eerily still. The centerpiece was the unfinished statue of a woman, her arms outstretched, her face a smooth void where features should have been. Miss Marple approached it, her footsteps soft on the gritty floor, and tilted her head to study the stone's contours. "A pity," she murmured, "to leave such beauty incomplete." Her attention shifted to the workbench where the murder had occurred. The coarse stable rope, its fibres frayed and ominous, had been photographed and catalogued, but left in place for now. Miss Marple bent closer, careful not to disturb it, noting its thickness and the faint scent of hay clinging to it. "Not a sculptor's tool," she said to herself, straightening. "Someone brought this with purpose." She recalled a village farrier who'd once used such rope to secure a gate, only for it to be stolen by a lad with darker intentions. Purpose, she knew, was the thread that tied a crime together. She moved slowly around the room, her eyes catching details that Constable Harrow's earnest but blunt investigation had missed. Near the statue's base, a faint scuff mark marred the floor, as if something heavy had been dragged. She crouched, her knees protesting, and peered closer. Embedded in the dust were tiny flecks of bronze, glinting like misplaced stars. "The figurine," she whispered, her mind returning to the missing bronze piece. "A dancer," the neighbour had said, small enough to fit in a pocket. Its absence was no mere theft, she suspected, but a clue to the killer's mind. Miss Marple rose and turned her attention to the shelves along the far wall, where Vane's smaller works were displayed. The gap where the figurine had stood was stark, surrounded by other bronzes. A rearing horse, a child with a hoop, a bird in flight. Each was exquisite, yet the empty space drew her eye like a missing tooth. She ran a finger along the shelf, noting a faint smudge of clay. Not the white marble dust of the workshop, but a reddish hue, as if from a different soil. "Curious," she said, filing the detail away. She thought of Mrs. Eldridge, whose garden shed had once held a stolen locket, traced by a smear of foreign earth. The door creaked, and Constable Harrow entered, his boots heavy on the threshold. "Anything catch your eye, Miss Marple?" he asked, his tone a mix of scepticism and hope. She smiled, her expression as benign as a vicar's sermon. "Only small things, Constable." "Tell me, have you found anything new since this morning?" Harrow rubbed his chin, consulting his notebook. "A few bits. One of Vane's neighbours, old Mister. Giles says he heard raised voices around 9. Couldn't make out words, but it sounded like an argument. And we found a scrap of paper under the workbench, torn, with just a bit of writing. Meet me at... Doesn't tell us much, but it's something." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "A meeting, perhaps planned, perhaps interrupted," she said. "And the statue, has anyone mentioned its significance?" Harrow shrugged. "Clara Bell said it was Vane's latest commission, meant for Sir Henry's garden. Been working on it for weeks, she said, but he was secretive about it." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the statue's blank face. A sculptor's work, she thought, was a mirror to their soul. What did this unfinished figure reflect about Vane's final days? She crossed to the corkboard, where sketches fluttered like trapped moths. Most were studies for the statue, angles of arms, curves of drapery, but one caught her eye, a rough drawing of a dancer, unmistakably the missing figurine. The sketch was annotated in Vane's precise hand, for R.K., in memory of better days. Miss Marple's lips pursed. "R.K.," she murmured. "Roland Kemp, the rival sculptor, whose bitterness had been palpable in Danefield. A shared history, perhaps, and a shared creation, now stolen in the wake of murder." "Constable," she said, turning to Harrow, "have you searched the grounds outside?" Harrow blinked, caught off guard. "Not thoroughly, miss. The yard's a mess, mud, leaves, hoofprints from the delivery cart." Miss Marple's smile was gentle but firm. "Hoofprints, yes, but perhaps other marks as well. A man in haste might leave traces." Harrow nodded, jotting a note, and Miss Marple stepped outside, her eyes scanning the muddy path leading to the barn. The yard was indeed a jumble, churned by cartwheels and recent rain. Yet near the workshop's side door, where the earth was softer, she spotted a single clear footprint, not a boot, but a shoe, its sole patterned with a diamond tread. It was too large for Clara, too refined for a labourer. She thought of Felix Durant's polished shoes, free of dust, and Sir Henry's tailored elegance. Or perhaps Kemp, whose heavy frame might leave such a mark. She made a mental note, knowing that shoes, like people, could betray their owners. As she returned to the workshop, a gust of wind stirred the air, carrying the faint clink of metal from a corner. Miss Marple followed the sound, her eyes narrowing as she spotted a small chisel, half hidden beneath a pile of rags. Its handle was chipped, and a faint stain, dark, almost like dried blood, marked the wood. She did not touch it, but beckoned Harrow over. "You might have this examined," she said. "It may be nothing, but small things often matter." Harrow bagged the chisel, his expression a mix of gratitude and bewilderment. Miss Marple took one last look around the workshop, her gaze lingering on the statue. Its silent presence seemed to watch her, as if guarding Vane's secrets. She thought of Miss Harmon, a spinster in her youth who'd hidden a lover's betrayal behind a serene smile. "People," Miss Marple said softly, "build such careful masks, but they always crack." She thanked Harrow and stepped into the fading light, her mind alive with possibilities. The workshop had spoken, in its way, through dust, bronze, and rope. Now she must listen to the living, for their words, too, would hold cracks waiting to be found. Chapter 4. The Apprentice's Tale. The lane to Clarabelle's cottage was lined with brambles, their thorns catching at Miss Jane Marple's tweed skirt as she made her way through the late afternoon gloom. The sky had turned sullen, heavy with the promise of rain, and the village of St. Mary Mead seemed to huddle against the coming storm. Miss Marple, undeterred by the weather, carried a basket of preserves under her arm, a pretext for her visit, for she knew that charity often opened doors that suspicion would keep shut. Clara, the young apprentice to the late Lionel Vane, was a thread in the tapestry of this murder, and Miss Marple intended to trace her pattern with care. The cottage was small, its thatch sagging, and its windows dim with grime. Clara opened the door at Miss Marple's gentle knock, her face pale as the plaster walls behind her. Her dark eyes, shadowed with fatigue, widened slightly at the sight of her visitor. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice a hesitant murmur, "what brings you here?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression as warm as a fireside. "Only a small gift, my dear," she said, lifting the basket. "Some jam for your mother, who I hear has been unwell." "May I come in?" Clara hesitated, then stepped aside, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. The sitting room was cramped, its air thick with the scent of damp wool and turpentine. A rickety table held a scattering of sketches, studies of hands and faces, drawn with a delicate but unsteady line. A single chair by the hearth was occupied by a shawl-wrapped figure, Mrs. Bell, whose cough punctuated the silence. Miss Marple set the basket down, her eyes taking in the room's meagre furnishings and the faint tremble in Clara's fingers. "I was so sorry to hear about Mr. Vane," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair Clara hastily cleared of papers. "It must be a dreadful shock for you, working so closely with him." Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. "It is," she whispered. "He was everything to me. Taught me how to see the stone, how to find the shape inside it." Her voice broke, and she turned away, busying herself with the kettle. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the stiffness in her movements, the way her shoulders hunched as if guarding a secret. "You were at the workshop yesterday, I believe," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but precise. "Until 6, you told Constable Harrow?" Clara's hand faltered on the kettle, a drop of water hissing on the stove. "Yes," she said quickly. "I was helping with the statue, the lady with the raised arms. Then I came home to Mother Mrs. Bell coughed again, her eyes half closed, offering no confirmation." Miss Marple's smile remained kind, but her mind was sharp. She recalled Mrs. Tuttle's claim that Clara hadn't arrived until dawn, a discrepancy that suggested more than a daughter's devotion. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Clara's hands, roughened by stonework but delicate, with that faint bruise circling her wrist like a shadow. "Your work must be hard on your hands," she said, her voice soft. Clara tucked her arm behind her back, her cheeks flushing. "It's just from lifting blocks," she said. "I'm clumsy sometimes." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, but she thought of young Elsie, a maid in her nephew's house, who'd worn similar marks from a suitor's grip and blamed them on a fall. Bruises, she knew, often told stories their bearers wished to hide. "Mr. Vane was a demanding master, I imagine," Miss Marple continued, "accepting a cup of weak tea." Clara's eyes flickered, a mix of grief and something darker. "He could be," she admitted. "He'd get cross if I made mistakes, chipped the stone wrong, or mixed the wrong plaster. Once, he threw a chisel across the room, not at me, but near enough to make me jump." She paused, her fingers tightening around her cup. "But he was brilliant. Without him, I'd never have learned to carve." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over Clara's words. Loyalty laced with fear, a familiar blend, she thought, like the village girl who'd stayed with a cruel employer for the sake of a wage. "You must have spent many hours with him," she said. "Did he ever speak of others? Friends or perhaps enemies?" Clara shook her head too quickly. "Not really. He kept to himself mostly, though he didn't like Mr. Durant, the critic, said his reviews were poison. And Mr. Kemp, Roland, he mentioned him sometimes, but not kindly." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Roland Kemp, the sculptor from Danefield?" Clara nodded, her gaze dropping again. "They knew each other years ago, before I came to work for Mr. Vane. He said Roland was jealous, always trying to outdo him, but never could Miss Marple filed this away, thinking of the sketch in the workshop, inscribed to R.K. A shared past, perhaps, and a shared resentment." "And Sir Henry Grayson?" she prompted. Clara shrugged. "He came by often talking about commissions. Mr. Vane liked his money, but not his manner. Called him a pompous ass once, when he thought I wasn't listening." Miss Marple smiled, amused by the candour. "Artists are particular, aren't they?" she said. "And you, my dear, were you happy working for him?" Clara's eyes met hers for a moment, then darted away. "Happy enough," she said, her voice barely audible. "It was a chance to learn, to be part of something beautiful." But her hands, still twisting the apron, told a different story. Miss Marple thought of the clay smudge in the workshop, the reddish hue unlike the marble dust. "Do you ever work with clay, Clara?" she asked casually. Clara blinked, startled. "Sometimes for models." "Why?" Miss Marple waved a hand. "Just curious, my dear. An old woman's fancy." As she rose to leave, Miss Marple's eyes fell on a small sketchbook by the table, its pages curled from use. A corner of a drawing peeked out, a dancer, much like the missing figurine. "What a lovely sketch," she said, pausing. Clara snatched the book away, her face flushed. "Just practice," she mumbled. Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene, but her mind was alight. The figurine, the bruise, the clay, small threads, but they wove a pattern. She thanked Clara and stepped into the gathering dusk, the first drops of rain pattering on her umbrella. As she walked back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the workshop's clues. The stable rope, the bronze flecks, the footprint. Clara's story, like the others, had gaps, and her fear was palpable. Was it grief for a mentor, or something deeper? Guilt, perhaps? Or the weight of a secret? Miss Marple recalled a girl in her youth who'd lied to protect a brother's crime, her hands trembling just as Clara's did. "Fear," she murmured, "is a heavy burden, but it always leaves a trace." She resolved to speak with Mrs. Tuttle, the neighbour, to test Clara's alibi, for in St. Mary Mead, truth often hid in the chatter of those who watched from their windows. Chapter 5. The Patron's Pride. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle, as Miss Jane Marple made her way up the winding drive to Grayson Manor, her umbrella a shield against the damp. The manor loomed ahead, its Georgian facade all symmetry and grandeur, its windows glowing with the warmth of wealth. Miss Marple, accustomed to the modest cottages of St. Mary Mead, felt the weight of such opulence, but her step remained brisk, her mind as sharp as the wind that tugged at her scarf. Sir Henry Grayson, Lionel Vane's patron, was a man of influence, and Miss Marple knew that influence often cloaked secrets as grand as the houses that held them. The butler, a solemn figure with a face like polished oak, admitted her into a hall adorned with tapestries and a chandelier that sparkled like a captured constellation. Sir Henry awaited her in his library, a room of dark wood and leather-bound books, where a fire crackled with an air of self-assured permanence. He rose as she entered, his broad frame filling the space, his smile as polished as the silver inkstand on his desk. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice booming with practised charm. "A pleasure, though I wish it were under happier circumstances. This business with Vane is a tragedy, a genius lost to us." Miss Marple settled into a plush chair, her basket of preserves, her excuse for the visit, resting on her lap. "Indeed, Sir Henry," she said, her tone gentle, but her eyes keen. "Mr. Vane's death has shaken the village. I understand you were one of his greatest supporters." Sir Henry nodded, his fingers brushing a gold cufflink. "I was. His sculptures grace my grounds, works of art that will outlive us all. I commissioned many, including his latest, that statue of the woman. A pity it remains unfinished." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the locked cabinet behind his desk, its brass keyhole gleaming in the firelight. "You visited him the evening he died, I believe," she said, her voice as soft as the rain outside. Sir Henry's smile flickered, though his composure held. "Yes, around 7. We discussed a new piece for my rose garden, a fountain perhaps with nymphs. I left by 8 as I told Constable Harrow. Vane was in fine form, full of plans." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite interest. "And you saw no one else at the workshop?" "Not a soul," Sir Henry said firmly, though his fingers drummed briefly on the armrest. "The place was quiet, save for Vane's hammering. He was always at work, you know, driven like all true artists." Miss Marple nodded, her mind catching on the discrepancy Harrow had mentioned. Sir Henry's car, parked near the workshop until nearly 10. A man of his stature, she thought, might not expect his word to be questioned, but time had a way of betraying even the proudest. She rose, thanking him for his time, and asked if she might see his gallery. "I've heard so much about Mr. Vane's sculptures," she said, her smile disarming. Sir Henry, ever the gracious host, led her to a long vaulted room where Vane's works stood in proud array. A marble Apollo dominated the centre, its muscled form gleaming under skylights, while smaller bronzes lined the walls, a hunter, a nymph, a lion in mid-roar. Miss Marple paused by the Apollo, her fingers brushing the air near its base. "Magnificent," she murmured, though her eyes were elsewhere, searching for a gap where a small bronze dancer might have stood. "You admired Mr. Vane's smaller works, too?" she asked, turning to Sir Henry. His brow creased slightly. "Oh, yes. though I preferred the grand pieces. He did mention a little figurine once, a dancer, I think, but I've no idea where it is." Miss Marple's lips pursed, a faint sign of her mind at work. The missing figurine, inscribed to R.K., seemed to haunt every corner of this case. "A pity it's gone," she said. "Small things often hold great meaning." As they returned to the library, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the locked cabinet. "Your private papers, I presume," she said, her tone light. Sir Henry's smile tightened. "Yes, correspondence and such. Nothing to interest you, Miss Marple." She nodded, her expression serene, but she thought of old Mr. Carver, a squire in her youth who'd kept a locked drawer full of compromising letters. Men like Sir Henry, she knew, guarded their pride as fiercely as their secrets. Before leaving, she paused in the hall, where a portrait of Sir Henry in hunting garb hung above a marble bust. "You must be proud of your collection," she said. Sir Henry's chest swelled. "I am." Vane was a difficult man, but his talent was worth it. I'll miss his work. Miss Marple smiled, her mind turning over his words. Pride, she thought, was a double-edged blade. It built empires and toppled them. She thanked him and stepped into the rain, her umbrella snapping open like a shield. As she walked back to St. Mary Mead, the manor fading into the mist, Miss Marple considered Sir Henry's polished demeanour. His story was smooth, but the late hour of his car's departure suggested a longer visit or a return. The locked cabinet nagged at her, a silent witness to something unspoken. She recalled a village doctor who'd hidden a scandal in a locked box, his charm masking a desperate need for control. Sir Henry, she suspected, was not so different. The rain softened as she reached her cottage, where the fire awaited. Settling into her armchair, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles clicking in rhythm with her thoughts. Sir Henry's pride, Clara's fear, the missing figurine, they were pieces of a puzzle, each edged with human weakness. She would visit Mrs. Tuttle next, to probe Clara's alibi and perhaps the Red Lion, where Felix Durant's story might unravel. Pride, she murmured, is a heavy mantle, but it frays under pressure. With that, she turned her gaze to the window, where the rain traced patterns as intricate as the case itself. Chapter 6. The Critic's Venom. The rain had eased to a fine mist as Miss Jane Marple stepped onto the high street of St. Mary Mead, her sensible shoes tapping a steady rhythm on the wet cobblestones. The tea room, a quaint establishment with lace curtains and a sign proclaiming Mrs. Puddock's finest brews, was her destination. Felix Durant, the art critic whose sharp pen had stung Lionel Vane, had agreed to meet her there, though his curt note had suggested reluctance. Miss Marple, undeterred by his brusqueness, knew that men like Durant often hid their truths behind a facade of disdain. Her umbrella now furled as swung lightly at her side, a prop as unassuming as her own demeanour. Inside, the tea room was warm, its air thick with the scent of scones and bergamot. Durant sat at a corner table, his thin frame hunched over a notebook, his pen scratching with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. His face, angular and pale, bore the look of a man who relished being feared. As Miss Marple approached, he glanced up, his eyes narrowing like a cat's in the sun. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice clipped, "I presume you're here to pry into Vane's unfortunate end. I've told the police all I know, but I suppose you've a reputation for meddling." Miss Marple smiled, settling into the chair opposite him, her basket of preserves, her perennial excuse, resting on the table. "Not meddling, Mr. Durant," she said, her tone as soothing as chamomile. "Merely seeking to understand. Mr. Vane's death has left a void, and you, as a critic, knew his work so well." Durant's lips twitched, a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "His work was slipping," he said, leaning back. "My last review said as much. Derivative, overblown. He didn't take kindly to it, I assure you." Miss Marple ordered a pot of tea, her eyes noting Durant's pristine attire. A tailored coat, a silk scarf, and shoes polished to a mirror sheen, untouched by the workshop's dust. "You saw him that evening, I believe," she said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "An argument, was it?" Durant's fingers tapped his notebook, a restless gesture. "Yes, around 8. I stopped by to discuss my review. Professional courtesy, you understand. Vane was livid, called me a hack, said I wouldn't know art if it struck me. I left him to his tantrum and went to the Red Lion for a drink." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze gentle but piercing. "And that was by 9:30, the barman said." Durant nodded, though his eyes flickered to the window. "About then. I needed something to wash away Vane's nonsense." Miss Marple's smile was placid, but her mind caught the gap in his timeline. 8 to 9:30, unaccounted for. She thought of Mr. Peebles, a village shopkeeper who'd once stretched a half-hour errand into a tale of hours to hide a meeting with a rival's wife. Time, she knew, was a slippery witness. "You must see many artists," she said, her voice light. "Do they all react so strongly to your reviews?" Durant's smirk returned, sharper now. "Most do." Vane was worse, thought himself a god of marble. "My words cost him commissions, you know. Sir Henry nearly withdrew his support after my last piece." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Sir Henry values your opinion, then?" Durant shrugged. "He values his status." "A bad review reflects on his taste, doesn't it?" Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to click in her mind as she wove Durant's words into the pattern. A critic's power, she thought, lay not just in ink, but in the wounds it left. "Did Mr. Vane ever mention a small bronze figurine?" she asked, watching his face. Durant's pen paused, a fleeting stillness. "A dancer, you mean?" He prattled about it once, said it was a personal piece, not for sale. "I didn't care for it. Too sentimental." Miss Marple nodded, her mind snagging on his quick dismissal. The figurine, inscribed to R.K., was a thread that tied the suspects together, and Durant's indifference felt rehearsed. The tea-room door jingled, admitting Mrs. Puddock with a tray of scones. Miss Marple seized the moment to shift the conversation. "You must know Roland Kemp, the sculptor from Danefield," she said. Durant's expression soured, his lips thinning. Kemp? A has-been, clinging to Vane's shadow. "He wrote to me once, begging for a kind review to boost his work. I declined. His pieces are as dull as his ambition." Miss Marple's smile remained serene, but she filed away the contempt. Envy and scorn, she thought, were two sides of a coin, and both could sharpen a motive. As she finished her tea, Miss Marple's eyes fell on Durant's notebook, its pages filled with tight, angular script. A corner of a page was torn, a jagged edge that caught her attention. "You keep busy, Mr. Durant," she said, gesturing to the notebook. "Reviews, I suppose?" He snapped it shut, his movements brisk. "Always. The world of art never sleeps." Miss Marple thought of the torn scrap found under Vane's workbench. "Meet me at—" and wondered if Durant's pen had written it. She rose, thanking him for his time, her gaze lingering on his shoes, still impossibly clean for a man who'd walked through a muddy village. Outside, the mist had thickened, cloaking Saint. Mary Mead in a soft haze. Miss Marple unfurled her umbrella, her thoughts as intricate as the lace at her collar. Durant's malice was clear, his words a weapon that had wounded Vane's pride and purse. The gap in his alibi, the torn page, the clean shoes, these were clues, small but sharp, like the pins in her sewing box. She recalled Miss Tuttle's gossip about a critic in her youth, whose cruel words had driven a painter to despair. Words, she murmured, can cut deeper than stone. Her next step would be to visit the Red Lion, to test Durant's story with the barman's memory. Then, perhaps, a word with Mrs. Tuttle about Clara's late-night arrival. As she walked, the mist curling around her, Miss Marple felt the case tightening like a knot. Durant's venom, Sir Henry's pride, Clara's fear, and Kemp's envy, they were all players in this drama, and the missing figurine was its silent star. She thought of her friend Mrs. Bantry, whose sharp tongue had once uncovered a neighbour's secret by chance. People talk, Miss Marple said to herself, and in their talk the truth slips out. With that, she turned toward the pub, her umbrella a steady companion in the gathering dusk. Chapter 7. The Rival's Shadow. The evening had deepened into a damp twilight as Miss Jane Marple boarded the creaking bus to Danefield, a village some 5 miles from St. Mary Mead, where Roland Kemp, the rival sculptor, kept his faltering studio. The bus rattled along the narrow lanes, its windows fogged with the breath of its few passengers, and Miss Marple, seated near the front, gazed out at the blurred hedgerows, her mind as clear as the chime of a church bell. Kemp, with his brooding resentment and flimsy alibi, was a figure of interest, and she intended to see him in his own domain, where masks often slipped under the weight of familiarity. Danefield was a quieter place than St. Mary Mead, its cottages huddled around a sluggish river that gleamed dully under the rising moon. Kemp's studio stood at the village's edge, a squat stone building that might once have been a mill, its roof sagging like a weary brow. As Miss Marple approached, her umbrella tapping the uneven path, she noted the air of neglect. Ivy clung to the walls, and a broken shutter hung askew, creaking in the breeze. The door was ajar, spilling a faint glow of lamplight, and she knocked softly, her manner as unassuming as a vicar's wife collecting for charity. Roland Kemp appeared in the doorway, a hulking figure with shoulders broad enough to carry stone. His face, weathered and lined, bore the look of a man who had wrestled with both marble and misfortune. His eyes, shadowed beneath heavy brows, narrowed at the sight of her. "Miss Marple, is it?" he said, his voice a low growl. "I heard you were sniffing about Vane's death." "What do you want with me?" Miss Marple smiled, undeterred by his brusqueness, and held up her basket, now a familiar prop. "Only a moment of your time, Mr. Kemp," she said. "I've brought some scones, Mrs. Puddock's recipe. May I come in?" Kemp hesitated, then stepped aside, his reluctance as palpable as the chill in the air. The studio was a cavern of neglect, its air thick with dust and the faint tang of rust. Unfinished sculptures loomed in the shadows, torsos without heads, arms without hands, as if Kemp's inspiration had abandoned him mid-stroke. Tools lay scattered on a workbench, their handles worn but idle, and a single lamp cast a feeble glow over a cracked marble slab. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, noting a coil of stable rope in a corner, its coarse fibres identical to the murder weapon in Vane's workshop. She made no comment, but her mind tucked the detail away, like a stitch in her knitting. "You were a friend of Mr. Vane's once, I understand, she said, settling onto a rickety stool Kemp offered. His jaw tightened, and he turned away, busying himself with a chisel, as if to avoid her gaze. "A long time ago," he said. "We trained together in London, shared a studio for a year." He had a knack for stealing the light, even then. His voice carried a bitter edge, sharp as the tools around him. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. Stealing the light? How so? Kemp's hands stilled, the chisel glinting in the lamplight. Lionel had a way of charming patrons, critics, anyone with coin or influence. My ideas, my designs, he'd take them, polish them, call them his own. By the time I realized, he was the darling of the art world, and I was left scraping by in this hole. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but searching. She thought of young Mr. Ellis, a gardener in St. Mary Mead, who'd lost a prize rose to a rival's sleight of hand. Envy, she knew, could fester like a wound. "You were in St. Mary Mead the night he died," she said, her tone as mild as a summer breeze. Kemp's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't turn. "I told Harrow I was walking by the river." "A man needs air, doesn't he?" Miss Marple's smile was placid. "Of course." Though young Billy Hodge thought he saw someone like you near Vane's workshop, close to midnight, Kemp spun around, his eyes flashing. "That boy's mistaken." "I wasn't there. I had no reason to see Lionel." His voice was firm, but his hands betrayed him, clenching the chisel until his knuckles whitened. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to a shelf where a few of Kemp's older works stood. A clay model of a horse, a bronze bust, none as polished as Vane's. "You and Mr. Vane shared a history," she said. "Perhaps a piece you worked on together?" Kemp's face darkened, and he set the chisel down with a clatter. "There was a figurine, years ago," he admitted. "A dancer, small, bronze. We designed it together, but Lionel claimed it, sold it to a collector. Said I'd get my share, but I never did." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind flashing to the sketch in Vane's workshop, inscribed to R.K. The missing figurine, she thought, was more than a trinket. It was a symbol of betrayal. "Did you ever see that figurine again?" she asked, watching his face. Kemp shook his head too quickly. "Not since London. Why?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "Only a thought. It's missing from Mr. Vane's workshop." You know, Kemp's eyes flickered, a shadow crossing his face, but he said nothing, turning instead to adjust a sculpture that needed no adjusting. Miss Marple noted the movement, so like her nephew's gardener when questioned about a missing spade. She rose, her basket in hand, and paused by the coil of rope. "You keep stable rope here," she said, her voice light. Kemp glanced at it, his expression guarded. "For hauling stone," he said. "It's strong, cheap." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The rope, the figurine, Kemp's bitterness. They wove a pattern dark and tight. She thanked him, her manner as warm as if she'd merely shared tea, and stepped into the night, the river's murmur a soft counterpoint to her thoughts. As the bus carried her back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple gazed at the moonlit fields, her mind sorting the threads of the case. Kemp's envy was raw, a wound that had festered for years. His alibi was weak, his presence near the workshop unconfirmed but plausible. The rope in his studio, the figurine's history, these were not proof, but they were pointers, like the stars that guided sailors. She thought of Miss Clara, whose fear had trembled in her hands, and Sir Henry, whose pride locked away secrets. Durant's malice, too, lingered in her mind, his clean shoes a silent question. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit the lamp and settled into her armchair, her knitting a familiar comfort. The figurine, she thought, was the key, not for its value, but for what it meant. A shared creation, a stolen triumph, a motive for murder. She recalled a village seamstress who'd sabotaged a rival's gown out of spite, her needle as sharp as her grudge. Envy, Miss Marple murmured, is a shadow that grows long tomorrow. She would visit the Red Lion to test Durant's alibi and speak with Mrs. Tuttle about Clara's night. For now, she let her needles click, each stitch a step closer to the truth. Chapter 8. The Village Whispers. The morning dawned grey over St. Mary Mead, with clouds hanging low like a quilt over the village. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, a modest spread of toast and marmalade before her, but her attention was elsewhere, her mind threading through the tangle of clues surrounding Lionel Vane's murder. The fire in her grate crackled softly, and her knitting lay folded in its basket, a quiet companion to her thoughts. The workshop's secrets, the stable rope, the bronze flex, the missing figurine, had given her much to ponder. But it was the human voices of the village, those ceaseless whispers, that often held the key to truth. Today she resolved to listen closely, for gossip, like a river, carried fragments of fact in its current. Her first stop was the post office, where Miss Eliza Tuttle presided with the vigilance of a hawk. The postmistress, a wiry woman with spectacles perched on her sharp nose, was a repository of village lore, her counter a stage for every rumour that passed through St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple entered with her usual basket, this time bearing a jar of her own gooseberry jam, a gesture that softened even Miss Tuttle's stern demeanour. "Good morning, Eliza," Miss Marple said, her smile as warm as the morning's absent sun. "I thought you might enjoy a taste of summer." Miss Tuttle's eyes gleamed, though her lips pursed with suspicion. "Very kind, Miss Marple," she said, accepting the jar. "I suppose you're here about poor Mr. Vane. Dreadful business, strangled like that." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle concern. "Indeed, it's shaken us all." "You've such a keen eye, Eliza. Did you notice anything unusual the evening he died?" Miss Tuttle preened, adjusting her spectacles. "Well, I don't like to gossip, but since you ask, I saw Sir Henry Grayson's car, that big black thing, parked near the workshop around 10. Far later than he told Constable Harrow. I'd wager Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly, her mind filing away the discrepancy. Sir Henry had claimed to leave by 8, yet his car lingered. "How interesting," she said. "Anyone else about?" Miss Tuttle leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That critic, mister. Durant was at the Red Lion, but I saw him walking toward the workshop just past 9, not toward the pub as he said. And Clara Bell, her mother's cottage is next to mine, you know. She didn't come home till nearly dawn, though she claims she was there all evening." Miss Marple's smile was placid, but her thoughts quickened. Clara's alibi, already fraying, was unravelling further, and Durant's movements were as slippery as his words. "And Mr. Kemp?" prompted. Miss Tuttle's nose wrinkled. "That sculptor from Danefield?" "Billy Hodge, the blacksmith's boy, swears he saw a man like him, tall, broad, near Vane's barn at midnight. Skulking, Billy said, though boys do exaggerate." Miss Marple nodded, thinking of the stable rope in Kemp's studio and the figurine's inscription to R.K. Whispers, she knew, were like her knitting, loose threads that, when pulled, revealed a pattern. Thanking Miss Tuttle, Miss Marple made her way to the Red Lion, the village pub where Felix Durant claimed to have spent his evening. The pub was quiet at this hour, its oak beams and polished bar gleaming in the dim light. The barman, Tom Carter, a stout man with a ruddy face, was wiping glasses when Miss Marple entered. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, his tone cheerful but wary. "Heard you're helping with the vein business." Terrible thing, Miss Marple smiled, settling at a table near the bar. "Indeed, Tom. I understand, mister. Durant was here the night Mr. Vane died. Can you recall when?" Tom scratched his chin, setting down a glass. "Aye, he came in around 9:30, maybe a bit later. Ordered a whisky, sat in that corner scribbling in his notebook. Stayed till closing. Near 11, Miss Marple's eyes flickered. Durant had left Vane's workshop at 8, yet didn't reach the pub until 9:30. A gap that echoed Miss Tuttle's sighting of him near the workshop. "Was he alone?" she asked. Tom nodded. "Mostly." Kept to himself, though he muttered something about Vane being a fool. Didn't seem in a rush to leave Miss Marple, thanked him, and stepped back into the village, her mind turning over the timelines. Sir Henry's car at 10, Durant's wanderings at 9, Clara's absence until dawn, Kemp's shadowy presence at midnight. Each was a piece of the puzzle, misaligned but telling. She decided to visit Mrs. Bell, Clara's mother, to probe the girl's alibi further. The cottage was as she'd left it, its air heavy with illness and neglect. Mrs. Bell, frail and wrapped in a shawl, greeted her with a weak smile. "Miss Marple," she rasped, "kind of you to call again." "I shan't trouble you long," Miss Marple said, setting her basket down. "I only wondered how Clara was faring with all this tragedy." Mrs. Bell's eyes clouded. "She's shaken, poor lamb. Was here with me that night, though she came and went. Said she had errands after seeing Mr. Vain Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Errands? Late in the evening?" Mrs. Bell nodded vaguely. "She's always rushing about." "Didn't come back till very late, but I was asleep by then." Miss Marple's smile hid her thoughts. Clara's story was crumbling like dry clay, and the bruise on her wrist, the sketch of the dancer, loomed larger in her mind. As she left the cottage, she thought of a village girl, years ago, who'd lied about her evenings to shield a secret love. "Lies," she murmured, "are like shadows. They stretch in the wrong light." The figurine, she suspected, was more than a stolen trinket. It was a link to the past, perhaps to Kemp, whose envy burned bright. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit the fire and settled into her armchair, her knitting a steady rhythm. The village's whispers had given her much. Sir Henry's lingering car, Durant's unaccounted hour, Clara's false alibi, Kemp's midnight shadow. Each suspect's story was a thread, knotted with motive, pride, malice, fear, envy. The figurine, inscribed to R.K., tied Kemp to Vane. But the clay smudge, the footprint, the torn note, these pointed elsewhere too. She recalled a neighbour, Mrs. Finch, whose gossip had once unravelling a theft by chance. "Voices," Miss Marple said softly, "carry more than they know." Tomorrow she would return to the workshop, for its silent clues might speak louder than the village's chatter. Chapter 9. The Statue's Clue. The morning air was crisp in St. Mary Mead, with a hint of frost sharpening the outlines of the village's rooftops. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her warmest shawl, made her way back to Lionel Vane's workshop, her steps measured but purposeful. The converted barn stood silent under the pale sun, its weathered timbers a stark contrast to the turmoil it had witnessed. Constable Harrow had granted her another visit, his trust in her knack growing despite his initial scepticism. Miss Marple, ever humble, carried no illusions about her role. She was merely an observer of human nature, and the workshop, she sensed, held truths that human tongues had yet to confess. Inside, the air was cold, laced with the faint grit of marble dust that clung to every surface. The unfinished statue of the woman, her arms raised in a gesture of eternal longing, dominated the room, its blank face a mute witness to Vane's final hours. Miss Marple paused before it, her eyes tracing the smooth curves of stone, her mind attuned to the subtle language of objects. "You saw it all," she murmured, as if the statue might reply. She had learned long ago, from a village carpenter who'd hidden a theft in a carved chest, that inanimate things often spoke when people fell silent. She began her inspection with care, her gloved hands hovering but never touching. The coarse stable rope still lay coiled on the workbench, its fibres a grim reminder of the violence it had wrought. Miss Marple's gaze moved to the statue's base, where she had previously noted faint scuff marks. Kneeling with a slight wince, she examined them closely, the cold stone biting through her stockings. The marks were shallow but deliberate, as if something heavy had been dragged across the base, leaving grooves in the dust. Within those grooves, she spotted more flecks of bronze, their metallic glint unmistakable. "The figurine," she said softly, her mind returning to the missing dancer, its absence a persistent note in this discordant case. Rising, she circled the statue, her eyes catching a new detail. A faint crack in the stone near the figure's feet, barely visible unless one looked closely. It was not the clean break of a chisel, but a jagged split, as if struck by force. Miss Marple tilted her head, picturing a struggle. Vane, perhaps, grappling with his killer. A tool or object falling against the statue. She thought of the chipped chisel found beneath the rags, its handle stained with what might be blood. "A moment of chaos," she murmured, "leaves such clear traces." Constable Harrow entered, his boots heavy on the floor, a notebook in hand. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, his moustache twitching with curiosity. "Found anything new?" She smiled, her expression as mild as milk. "Perhaps, Constable. Have you examined the statue's base?" Harrow frowned, crouching beside her. "These scratches. Thought they were from Vane's work." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I think not. See the bronze dust? It suggests the figurine was here, perhaps knocked over in a scuffle." Harrow's eyes widened, and he scribbled in his notebook, his respect for her growing. "There's more," Miss Marple said, pointing to the crack. "This damage is recent, I believe. Something struck the statue, hard enough to mar it." Harrow nodded, his brow furrowing. "Could be from the struggle." "We found something else this morning. A button caught in the workbench's edge. Monogrammed with an R. Thought you'd want to know." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind flashing to Roland Kemp, the rival sculptor whose initials matched the clue. "Indeed," she said, "a button is such a personal thing, don't you think?" Like a signature left behind. She moved to the workbench, where the button, a small brass thing with an ornate R, lay in a paper envelope. Its thread was frayed, as if torn in haste. "Not Clara's," she mused aloud, "nor Sir Henry's, nor Mr. Durant's. Their coats are too fine for such a button." Harrow nodded. "Kemp's the likely one. His coat's old, patched. Saw it when I questioned him." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her face remained serene. A button, she thought, was like the loose thread in her knitting. Pull it, and the whole fabric might unravel. She turned her attention to the corkboard, where vain sketches hung like leaves on a tree. The drawing of the dancer, inscribed to R.K., still tugged at her thoughts. She studied it again, noting the careful lines, the tenderness in the figure's pose. A shared creation, she said almost to herself, and a shared wound. The figurine, she suspected, was not merely stolen but taken with intent, a trophy of vengeance or a reminder of betrayal. She recalled a village baker who'd kept a rival's recipe book, not to use it, but to gloat over his triumph. "Constable," she said, turning to Bow. "Harrow, have you searched the grounds again? That footprint by the side door, has it been matched?" Harrow shook his head. "Not yet, miss. The mud's too churned for a clear cast, but it's a man's shoe, diamond tread, not common here." Miss Marple nodded, thinking of Durant's polished shoes and Sir Henry's tailored elegance. Kemp's heavy boots, she recalled, were scuffed but plain, yet a man might own more than one pair. "Keep looking," she said. "The ground holds secrets as well as the workshop." As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple took one last look at the statue, its blank face seeming to watch her. The bronze flecks, the crack, the button, these were not mere accidents, but markers of a moment, a clash of passion and purpose. She thought of Mrs. Hartley, a widow in her youth who'd found a stolen brooch hidden in a flower pot, its pin bent from a struggle. "Objects," Miss Marple murmured, "are so very truthful." She thanked Harrow and stepped into the frosty air, her mind alight with the statue's silent testimony. Back in St. Mary Mead, she planned her next move. The button pointed to Kemp, but the figurine's absence suggested a deeper motive, one that might touch Clara's fear, Durant's malice, or Sir Henry's pride. She would visit Mrs. Tuttle again to press further on Clara's alibi, and perhaps the blacksmith to confirm Billy Hodges' sighting of Kemp. The village's whispers, the workshop's clues, they were converging like the lines of her knitting into a pattern only she could see. "Truth," she said softly, "is carved from patience." With that, she walked home, her shawl tight against the cold, her thoughts as sharp as the frost. Chapter 10. The confrontation. The vicarage in St. Mary Mead stood as a beacon of calm amidst the village's unrest, its ivy-clad walls glowing softly in the late afternoon light. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl neatly folded over her arm, had requested a gathering there, ostensibly for tea, but with a purpose far weightier. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, ever eager to aid in village matters, had arranged for the suspects, Clara Bell, Sir Henry Grayson, Felix Durant and Roland Kemp, to join her, along with Constable Harrow. Miss Marple knew that truth, like a shy guest, often emerged when people were pressed together, their masks slipping under scrutiny. Her knitting bag rested at her feet as she entered the vicarage's drawing room, her demeanour as unassuming as the faded chintz curtains. The room was warm, a fire crackling in the grate, but the air held a tension that no amount of tea could dispel. Clara sat by the window, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes darting like a trapped bird's. Sir Henry stood near the mantel, his broad frame imposing, his smile a touch too polished. Felix Durant lounged in an armchair, his sharp features set in a mask of boredom, though his fingers tapped restlessly on his notebook. Roland Kemp, hulking and sullen, occupied a corner, his gaze fixed on the floor as if it might yield answers. Constable Harrow stood by the door, his notebook ready, his moustache bristling with anticipation. Mrs. Clement bustled in with a tray of teacups, her chatter a valiant attempt to lighten the mood. "Such a sad occasion," she said, pouring tea. "But I'm sure Miss Marple has something wise to share." Miss Marple smiled, accepting a cup with a nod of thanks. "You're too kind, Mrs. Clement," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of authority. "I've only been listening, as old women do, to what the village and Mr. Vane's workshop have to say, and they've said a great deal." She set her cup down, her eyes moving from face to face, each suspect a thread in the tapestry she'd woven. "Mr. Vane's death," she began, "was no random act. It was born of passion, anger, envy, pride. The stable rope, the missing figurine, the button with an R. These are not mere objects, but markers of a motive. Let us consider them." Clara's hands tightened. Sir Henry's smile faltered. Durant's pen stilled, and Kemp's shoulders hunched further, but none spoke. Miss Marple turned to the group, her tone gentle but relentless. "The rope, coarse and from a stable, was not Mr. Vane's. It was brought with intent by someone who knew its strength. The figurine, a bronze dancer, inscribed to RK, was taken not for value but for meaning. And the button, monogrammed, caught in the workbench, points to a struggle." She paused, letting the words settle like dust. "Each of you was near the workshop that night, and each has a story with gaps." She looked at Clara, whose pale face seemed to shrink under her gaze. "Clara, you said you left at 6 for your mother, yet Mrs. Tuttle saw you only at dawn. Your bruise, my dear, suggests more than a mishap with stone." Clara's eyes filled, but she said nothing, her lips trembling. Miss Marple turned to Sir Henry. "Your car lingered until 10, Sir Henry, though you claim to leave by 8. A locked cabinet in your study holds secrets, perhaps." Sir Henry's face reddened, his hand gripping the mantle. "I've nothing to hide," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. To Durant she said, "Your argument with Mr. Vane left you at 8, yet you reached the Red Lion at 9:30, seen near the workshop in between. Your shoes, so clean, suggest care to avoid traces." Durant's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing. "I've explained my evening," he snapped, but his fingers betrayed him, crumpling a page in his notebook. Finally, she turned to Kemp, whose massive frame seemed to shrink. "Mr. Kemp, Billy Hodge saw a man like you at midnight, and your studio holds rope like the murder weapon. The figurine, a shared creation, was a wound you never forgave." Kemp's head jerked up, his eyes blazing. "You've no proof," he growled. But Miss Marple raised a hand, her calm unshaken. "Proof, Mr. Kemp, lies in patterns. The figurine, inscribed to you, was taken not for theft, but for vengeance. You and Mr. Vane shared a past, a dancer you designed together. He claimed it, rose to fame, while you languished. That night you went to confront him, didn't you? Not to kill, perhaps, but anger is a spark that spreads." The room was silent, save for the fire's crackle. Miss Marple's voice softened, but her words cut like a chisel. "You argued, and in a moment of rage, you used the rope you'd brought, perhaps to bind stone, but it bound a life instead. The figurine you took as a bitter trophy, a reminder of what you'd lost." Kemp's face drained of colour, his hands clenching into fists. "You can't know that," he whispered, but his voice cracked, and he lurched toward the door. Constable Harrow stepped forward, his hand firm on Kemp's arm. "Stay where you are, mister." "Kemp," he said, his tone steady. Kemp's shoulders slumped, and he sank back into his chair, his eyes hollow. Miss Marple watched him, her expression one of quiet sorrow. "Envy," she said almost to herself, "is a heavy burden. It carves deep wounds, deeper than stone." Mrs. Clement, wide-eyed, broke the silence. "Miss Marple, how did you know?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "People, my dear, are not so different from my knitting. Their threads tangle, but they always form a pattern." She rose, her shawl draped neatly, and nodded to Harrow. "I'll leave the rest to you, Constable." "I'm sure, mister, Kemp has more to say." As she stepped toward the door, the suspect's eyes followed her. Clara's tearful, Sir Henry's stunned, Durant's wary. Kemp's gaze, however, remained on the floor, as if seeing the weight of his own shadow. Outside, the air was sharp, the village settling into dusk. Miss Marple walked home, her mind already untangling the threads of the case. The figurine, the rope, the button, they had pointed to Kemp, but it was his heart, heavy with years of resentment, that had confessed. She thought of a village tailor, long ago, who'd sabotaged a rival's work out of jealousy, his hands trembling as Kemp's had. "Human nature," she murmured, "is the truest clue." With that, she turned toward her cottage, the vicarage's lights fading behind her, the truth laid bare in the quiet of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 11. The Confession, the Police Station in St. Mary Mead was a modest affair, a squat brick building tucked behind the village green. Its single cell rarely used for more than the occasional drunk or petty thief. On this grey morning, however, it held Roland Kemp, whose broad frame seemed to dwarf the narrow bench where he sat, head bowed, hands clasped as if in prayer. Miss Jane Marple, at Constable Harrow's request, had come to hear the sculptor's statement, her presence a quiet reassurance amid the station's stark formality. She sat in a wooden chair, her knitting, bag at her feet, her eyes gentle but unyielding as they studied Kemp's defeated posture. The air was heavy with the scent of ink and damp stone, and outside a light rain pattered against the window, a soft counterpoint to the gravity within. Constable Harrow stood by his desk, his notebook open, his moustache twitching with the weight of the moment. "Mr. Kemp," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "Miss Marple's here to listen, as am I. You've something to say about Mr. Vane's death." I reckon Kemp raised his head, his eyes hollow, the lines of his face etched deeper by the night's confinement. He looked at Miss Marple, then away, as if her calm gaze were too much to bear. "I didn't mean to kill him," he said, his voice low, cracking like dry clay. "I swear it." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her hands folded in her lap. "Tell us, mister." "Kemp," she said, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "What happened that night?" Kemp drew a shuddering breath, his massive hands clenching and unclenching. "I went to his workshop, yes, around midnight. I'd been walking by the river, thinking, brooding maybe, about how he'd taken everything. My patrons, my name, even that figurine we made together years ago in London. The dancer, it was our first piece, a shared dream. He sold it, kept the money, left me with nothing but promises." Miss Marple nodded, her mind flashing to the sketch in Vane's workshop, inscribed to R.K. with words of memory. "You felt betrayed," she said softly. Kemp's eyes met hers, raw with pain. "Betrayed? More than that. He laughed at me, Miss Marple. That night, I went to ask for my due. Not money, just credit, a mention of my part in that dancer. He was at his workbench, chipping away at that statue of his, and when I spoke, he laughed. Said I was a failure, clinging to his coattails, that I'd never match him. His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands. I'd brought the rope. Thought I might need it to haul some stone if we talked business. But when he laughed, something snapped. I grabbed him, the rope in my hands, and I don't know how it happened. It was over so quick. He was on the floor still, and I was standing there, the rope limp in my grip. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her heart ached for the waste of it all. She thought of young Peter, a village lad who'd lashed out in anger over a stolen sweetheart, his regret as heavy as Kemp's. "And the figurine?" she asked gently. Kemp's shoulders slumped further. "I saw it on the shelf, that dancer we'd made." It was like seeing my own heart, mocked by his success. I took it, not to sell but to keep, to remember what we'd been before he turned on me. He reached into his coat, producing the small bronze figure, its delicate form gleaming in the dim light. Harrow took it, bagging it carefully, his eyes flicking to Miss Marple with something like awe. She studied Kemp, her mind piecing together the final threads. The button with the R, torn in the struggle, the bronze flecks on the statue's base, where the figurine had fallen, the stable rope, a tool-turned weapon, all pointed to this moment of rage. "You didn't plan it," she said, her voice steady. "But anger, Mr. Kemp, is a fire that consumes more than its target." Kemp nodded, tears streaking his weathered face. "I know it now," he whispered. "I'd give anything to take it back." Harrow cleared his throat, his pen poised. "We'll need a formal statement, mister." "Kemp, you'll be charged, but your honesty helps." Miss Marple rose, her shawl draped neatly, and touched Kemp's arm lightly. "You've done right to speak," she said. "The truth, though painful, sets a burden down." Kemp looked at her, his eyes searching for judgment and finding only compassion. She thought of Mrs. Lyle, a widow who'd forgiven a thief who'd confessed, her mercy a balm to both. As she left the station, the rain had softened to a mist, cloaking Saint, Mary Mead in a gentle haze. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind reflecting on the case's resolution. Clara's fear had been real, but born of Vane's temper, not guilt. Sir Henry's pride had hidden no crime, only vanity. Durant's malice had wounded Vane's reputation, but not his life. It was Kemp's envy, nursed over years, that had carved the fatal blow. She recalled a village carpenter whose jealousy of a rival's skill had led to sabotage, his confession as raw as Kemp's. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit the fire and settled into her armchair, her knitting a quiet comfort. The figurine, now recovered, was a symbol of a friendship betrayed, its theft a final act of defiance. She thought of the statue in Vane's workshop, its blank face a mirror to the emptiness of envy. "People," she murmured, "build their own prisons." With that, she picked up her needles, the rhythm of her stitches a steady promise that St. Mary Mead, for now, could rest. Chapter 12. The Quiet Return. The clouds parted over St. Mary Mead, and a tentative sun cast its light across the village, gilding the thatched roofs and glinting off the wet cobblestones. Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage window, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of a metronome, her eyes tracing the familiar outlines of the high street. The murder of Lionel Vane, which had stirred the village like a storm, had settled into a sombre resolution with Roland Kemp's confession. The air of St. Mary Mead seemed to exhale, as if relieved to return to its quiet routines. But Miss Marple knew that beneath its calm surface, the village held memories of human frailty as enduring as its ancient oaks. She sipped her tea, the cup warm in her hands, and reflected on the threads that had woven the case together. The stable rope, the bronze figurine, the monogrammed button, each had pointed to Kemp. But it was the deeper currents of envy and betrayal that had driven him to his desperate act. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Grayson, a village matron who had once harboured a grudge over a lost baking contest. Her bitterness a quiet poison until forgiveness set her free. Envy, Miss Marple murmured, is a sculptor of sorrow, carving wounds that never fully heal. The village had begun to mend itself. Clara Bell, freed from suspicion, had taken over Vane's workshop with a quiet determination. Miss Marple had seen her there yesterday, her delicate hands coaxing life from stone, her face no longer shadowed by fear. The bruise on her wrist, a mark of Vane's temper, was fading, and her sketches, now bolder, more confident, suggested a talent ready to bloom. Miss Marple smiled, thinking of young Sally, a seamstress's apprentice who had found her own strength after a harsh mistress's departure. Clara, she felt, would carve her own path, unburdened by the past. Sir Henry Grayson, ever the proud patron, had wasted no time in commissioning a new piece from Clara, a fountain for his rose garden, to replace the unfinished statue Vane had left behind. Miss Marple had heard from Mrs. Clement that Sir Henry's locked cabinet held no dark secrets, only ledgers of his investments, a testament to his vanity rather than guilt. His car's late departure that night, it turned out, was due to a driver's dalliance with a village girl, a fact Sir Henry had been too proud to admit. Miss Marple chuckled softly, recalling Mr. Hartley, whose pride had hidden a similar embarrassment over a misplaced watch. Felix Durant, the critic, had written a surprisingly tempered review of Clara's early work published in the county paper. Miss Marple suspected the sting of suspicion had chastened him, his venom dulled by the village's scrutiny. His gap in time that night, she'd learned from the Red Lion's barman, was spent drafting a letter to a rival critic, a petty act of professional spite rather than murder. She thought of Miss Finch, whose sharp tongue had softened after a neighbour's kindness exposed her loneliness. Words, Miss Marple mused, can wound or heal, depending on the heart behind them. As for Roland Kemp, he awaited trial in the county jail, his confession a heavy stone lifted from his soul, but not from his fate. The bronze dancer, returned to Vane's workshop, now stood on Clara's workbench, a quiet reminder of a friendship lost to ambition. Miss Marple had seen it there, its delicate form catching the light, and felt a pang for Kemp, whose talent had been overshadowed by his pain. She recalled a village poet, whose verses turned bitter after a rival's praise, his life diminished by his own resentment. "We choose our chains," she said softly, her needles clicking in time with her thoughts. The village was quiet now, its gossip turning to harvest fairs and church bazaars. Miss Marple rose, setting her knitting aside, and stepped into her garden, where the last roses clung stubbornly to their stems. She bent to sniff one, its scent a fleeting gift, and looked out at Saint. Mary Mead, its houses nestled like sleeping children. The case had ended, but her work, she knew, was never done, for human nature was a puzzle that never stayed solved. She thought of her friend Mrs. Bantry, whose garden had once hidden a secret tryst, uncovered by a single misplaced ribbon. "Life," Miss Marple said to the roses, "is a pattern, and we must keep weaving." She returned to her cottage, the fire low but warm, and picked up her needles once more. The rhythm of her knitting was a promise of order, of clarity, of the quiet return to peace. St. Mary Mead would hum along, its secret safe until the next ripple stirred its surface. Until then, Miss Marple would watch, her eyes as sharp as her needles, ready for whatever the village might bring.